The Hopwood family of Liverpool just exist on £30 and 53 pence a week.
Food is a big item in our budget, but there's some things that make it all worthwhile.
Do you remember the things that quietly told you you'd grown up poor, before you even knew what that meant? Those everyday items and habits weren't just normal. They were how families got by when money ran out before the month did. But looking back now, why do some of those memories feel warmer than they should? When the house got cold, and I mean the kind of cold that made your breath visible indoors, there was no fancy heating system to save the day. What we had was the oven. That bulky thing in the kitchen did more than just make dinner. You opened it, turned it on, and just stood there with your hands out like you were roasting marshmallows. Some families even pulled chairs up in front of it, treating the oven like it was a fireplace. Of course, it was not safe, and everyone knew that. But it was either that or freeze. Blankets and socks only got you so far. When the wind came howling through those thin windows, and the thermostat might as well have been a decoration, the oven was your best friend. Sometimes you would fall asleep on the floor in front of it, wrapped up in layers, and your parents would just let you. They understood. Everyone understood. It was just how things were. And if you never had to warm your hands inside your own house using the oven, well, count yourself lucky. You did not grow up poor, not like that, because when you did, heat was a luxury, and ovens became lifelines. You always hoped you got to go first. First meant warm water, at least for a few minutes. By the time the second kid got in, the water was already cloudy. Third, lukewarm and gray. If you were the last one in line, and God help you if you had more than 3 siblings, you were basically sitting in a sad soup of someone else's day. But we still did it. It was normal. Hot water cost money. Running a full tub for every kid was not realistic when bills were always looming. So we lined up, waited, and made do. There was a weird kind of quiet solidarity in it too. You would hold your breath when it was your turn, trying not to splash or stir up what was at the bottom. And your parents were just trying to keep things running. There was no time for shame, only schedules and hot water limits. It was not just about being clean, it was about getting through the week without another expense. You were lucky to have a bar of soap and a towel that was not already soaking. People talk about sibling bonding. Well, nothing bonds kids like a shared bath full of compromise. You did not follow a recipe. You followed whatever was left. A dented can of green beans, a bag of rice with a rubber band around it, half a hot dog from lunch. That was dinner. You threw it in a dish, topped it with something crunchy if you had it, and called it a casserole. Most of the time it worked. Sometimes it really did not. But you ate it anyway because there was no plan B. It was food, it was hot, and it had your parents crossing their fingers that you would not complain. They called it a pantry night, but you knew what that meant. The grocery budget ran out before the groceries did. Maybe you got a can of cream of mushroom soup in there to pull it all together. That stuff was like gold, turned anything into a meal. And if it came out tasting weird, you just drowned it in ketchup. Everyone sat down, said grace, and hoped it would last until morning. Leftovers became the next day's breakfast. It was not gourmet. It was survival. You learned early that food was not always about taste. It was about staying full. There was a jug in the fridge that was never quite right. You knew it the moment you poured it. Too thin, too pale, and it never quite smelled like real milk. That was powdered milk, and it was what you drank when the money ran out before the month did. Sometimes your parents would mix it with a little real milk, trying to trick you. But kids are smart. You could taste the lie. It was chalky, watery, and no amount of stirring could change it. Still, you drank it because that is what survival looked like. Swallowing what you had, not what you wanted. Your parents told you it was almost the same, but your tongue never forgot. Sometimes you even held your breath just to get through a glass. And somehow, over time, you stopped noticing the difference. Still, you drank it. You had to. Cereal needed something. Pancakes needed a splash. And your family needed to stretch that gallon out for just a few more days. The box of powdered milk sat in the back of the pantry like a reminder. Things are tight again. Nobody wanted to use it, but everybody understood. And if you were lucky, your mom would add a little sugar, maybe even some vanilla, just to help you swallow it. That was the kind of magic poor families pulled off, making something out of nothing. And when that pitcher hit the table, nobody rolled their eyes. They just grabbed a glass and kept going. You knew not to expect butter when you opened that tub. You could be staring at mashed potatoes, spaghetti, even soup. Country crock containers were the unofficial Tupperware of every low-income kitchen. Why buy new when you could reuse what you already had? There were whole shelves of the fridge filled with those beige tubs, all with different mystery meals inside. You never trusted the label, "I can't believe it's not butter," meant surprise stew in our house. Sometimes you would open 3 before you found the one you were looking for. It became a kind of lottery, and everyone played. And even if it was the wrong one, you still made it work. If you asked your mom what was for dinner, she would pull one out and just say, "We'll see." It was efficient, it was smart, and it saved more money than you might think. You would peel off that lid, give it a sniff, and figure out if it was edible or if it had crossed over into compost. Some tubs lasted months, rotating from one meal to the next. When one finally cracked, it hurt more than it should have. That was a good container. It had history, and you never threw one out without trying to repurpose it one last time. Maybe for craft supplies, maybe for storing pennies. Growing up poor meant everything had value, especially an empty butter tub that could feed your family twice over. Your winter coat did not come from a store. It came from a cardboard box in the back of a church basement. Sometimes it still had another kid's name written on the inside tag. If it fit, it was yours. If it did not, well, you wore it anyway. Sleeves too long? Roll them up, torn at the seam? Safety pin it. That coat was not about style. It was about getting through a cold walk to school without freezing. Sometimes the zipper did not work, so you just layered sweaters underneath. Other times it smelled like someone else's home, someone else's life, and you learned to get used to it. But it kept out the wind, and that was what mattered. You were not trying to impress, you were trying to stay warm. Some kids laughed, sure, but others understood. They had their own secondhand jackets with frayed cuffs and broken zippers. You would stuff the pockets with tissues, mittens, maybe a piece of candy if you got lucky. The smell of mothballs and someone else's laundry detergent never quite went away. But you were warm, and that was the goal. Your parents were just grateful you had anything at all. Church drives, charity bins, community boxes, these were lifelines, quiet acts of kindness that meant everything. And when you wore that coat, you wore it with pride. Because you knew it was more than just fabric. It was proof that someone somewhere cared. When your shoes gave out, you did not get new ones. You got a piece of cardboard and a pair of scissors. You traced your foot, cut it out, and slid it right into the bottom of your sneaker. Instant fix, kind of. It held just long enough to make it through school. Maybe through a week if you were lucky. But rain? Forget it. One step in a puddle and that patch turned to mush. You would walk around with squishy socks and try not to let anyone notice. Some kids had brand names, but you had duct tape and determination. If the sole flapped, you learned how to step quieter. You became your own cobbler before you even knew what that word meant. Still, your parents did what they could. Shoes were expensive. You only got one pair a year, if that. So you made them last. Duct tape, glue, cardboard, and hope. Kids these days do not know what it means to feel gravel through the bottom of their foot and just keep walking. But we did, and we made it work. You would sit on the front step, holding your shoe open, trying to wedge that fresh piece of cereal box into the right spot. And when it finally fit, you felt proud. You fixed it. You were back in business. One more day, one more walk, one more step. That shirt had seen some things. First, your older brother wore it, then your sister. Then it landed in your drawer, faded, stretched, maybe a little stained, but still perfectly wearable. That is what clothes were like when you grew up poor. You did not own them. You inherited them. Jeans with patched knees, t-shirts with cracked logos. You learned not to complain because there was no use in it. Some of the clothes still smelled like another house, and it took a few washes to make them yours. Others came with tiny holes you had to hide with a jacket or long hair, but each piece carried a bit of family history. You wore those stories like armor, proud even when it did not fit quite right. Your parents were just doing their best to clothe all of you. You would grow into it, or out of it. Either way, someone else was waiting for it next. And when you finally did get something new, on your birthday, maybe Christmas, it felt like treasure. But the rest of the year, hand-me-downs did the job. You even started to like them. They came with stories, worn in, broken in, lived in. Every seam had survived something, and you carried it forward, one sibling to the next, like a quiet baton passed down through childhood. You could set the table for 5 and not one plate would match. One had a flower pattern, one had a chip, one was from some long-gone restaurant your aunt used to work at. It was like a jigsaw puzzle of dinnerware, and nobody thought twice about it. Because plates were plates. They held food, and that was their only job. You might even eat off a paper towel if all the plates were in the sink, or a lid from a plastic container. You never thought it was weird until you went to someone's house where everything matched. Even the forks looked like they belonged together. At your house, it was a buffet of old finds, thrift shop gems, and donations from relatives who moved. But somehow, those mismatched plates made dinner feel even more like home. Whatever worked. You did not have sets or silver. You had spoons that bent and forks with loose prongs. But every night, that table filled up. Not with style, but with people. And when the food hit the mismatched plates, it felt like home. Your mom still tried to make it look nice, laying out napkins and pouring water into jelly jars. That kind of effort meant more than a perfect place setting ever could. You needed privacy, not perfection. So when there was no door on the bathroom, or your bedroom was just a corner of the living room, you hung up a towel, just a plain old bath towel looped over a hanger or thumbtacked to the wall. That became your curtain, your door, your little slice of personal space. It did not block sound. It barely blocked light. But it gave you something. And when you are growing up poor, something is everything. Maybe the towel had holes. Maybe it was thin enough to see through. But when it hung in that doorway, it gave you room to breathe. Even if you could hear the whole house, it gave you 5 minutes to feel alone. It made a corner feel like a bedroom. And it turned barely enough into just enough. But it was yours. You would pull it aside like you were stepping into a new room, even if it was just the same old cramped apartment. Sometimes you had to change clothes behind that towel while your siblings waited their turn. No complaints, no judgment, just understanding. Everyone had their own towel at some point, and when guests came over, you pretended it was intentional, part of the charm, but deep down, you knew. It was not design. It was survival. There was nothing like a TV dinner night. Not because it was gourmet, far from it, but because it was different. The kind of different that made you feel like something special was happening, even if it was just a regular Tuesday. That little silver tray with separated compartments filled with mystery meat, soggy vegetables, and mashed potatoes that somehow stayed frozen in the middle even after 10 minutes in the oven, it was magic. You peeled the foil back like opening a gift. And you sat on the floor, plate balanced on your lap, eyes glued to whatever was playing on the old television. Maybe Wheel of Fortune, maybe reruns. It did not matter. You did not care if the corn touched the brownie. You ate every bite like it was steak. It was not just the food, it was the feeling of being treated, even just for one meal. It made your living room feel like a little restaurant. What mattered was that you got your own dinner, your own moment, and no one had to cook or wash a pan afterward. That was a win. You did not get TV dinners often, though. They were pricey for what they were. One tray might feed one kid if you were lucky. So when they did show up, you knew something was different. Maybe someone had a coupon. Maybe your parents wanted a break. Maybe it was just a small way to feel fancy. And fancy was rare. That tray was not just dinner, it was a reward. A tiny luxury in a world where luxuries were few and far between. You could hear it before you sat down. That crinkle, that squeak. The stiff, sticky protest of vinyl against skin. Plastic covers on the couch were just part of the furniture. Literally. Your grandma's house had them. Your aunt's house had them. Maybe even your own house. The couch underneath was probably beautiful, some floral print from the 60s or a velvet pattern that had seen better decades. But nobody ever saw it, because the plastic stayed on, no matter what. Through holidays, birthdays, and every episode of The Price is Right. Why? Because that couch was the most expensive thing in the room, and your parents were going to keep it clean, no matter how uncomfortable that made it. You stuck to it in shorts, you slid off it in sweatpants, but that plastic meant protection, and protection meant saving money. You knew comfort could wait, cleaning bills could not. You would stick to it in the summer and slide off it in the winter, and God help you if you jumped on it. That plastic would bite, but you got used to it. Eventually, the sound became a background track to your childhood, and you stopped noticing. It was just how things were. The couch was not for comfort, it was for preservation, for protection. Because when you do not have a lot, you protect what you do have, even if it means sitting on what feels like a sandwich bag filled with bricks. That plastic was not just plastic. It was a reminder that nothing could be wasted. You did not go to the store for toys. You waited for a birthday, for a holiday, or for that rare miracle, a trip to a fast food place with a toy inside the bag. That was your jackpot. That little plastic figure or puzzle or spinning top meant more than a shelf full of the latest gadgets, because it was yours. You might not have even known the cartoon it came from, but it became your favorite anyway. You named it. You made up stories. And you kept it longer than any kid with 10 toys ever would. Then there were church giveaways. Sometimes they passed out toys around Christmas. Cheap ones, simple ones, but they were gold to you. A little foam football, a tiny doll with yarn hair. You cherished those toys not because they were fancy, but because they were rare. They came wrapped in hope and handed out with love. No batteries needed, just imagination. And when the plastic paint chipped, you just pretended it gave the toy more character. You held onto it like treasure because it was. Not every kid got a toy. And if you got one, you knew better than to take it for granted. You might trade it with your cousins. You might sleep with it next to your pillow. It was not just about the toy. It was about the moment. That rare moment when you were seen. When someone, somewhere, thought you deserved something fun. And when you grew up poor, that meant everything. You knew the sound they made when they clinked together. That was the sound of nickels, sometimes dimes. Empty soda bottles were not trash, they were currency. You gathered them from under porches, in ditches, behind fences. Maybe even from the neighbor's recycle bin, if you were bold. You rinsed them, lined them up, and took them to the corner store. The guy behind the counter would count them with a grunt, drop the coins into your hand, and suddenly you had spending power, candy money, arcade money, maybe enough to get a cold drink of your own. It took effort, sure. But it was yours. You earned it. And that made it better than any allowance. Some kids never had to do that. They got money just for being kids. But for you, every bottle was a step closer to something sweet, something fun, something just for you. And that taught you something early. That a little work could turn into a little joy. That value was hiding in the things other people threw away. And that even if your pockets were empty, your hands were never idle. Real ice cream came once a summer maybe, but most of the time you made your own. You took an old coffee can, filled it with Kool-Aid mix, sugar, milk, or whatever substitute your parents had, and shook the life out of it with a bag of ice and salt around it. Everyone took turns rolling it back and forth across the kitchen floor. It was loud, messy, and completely magical. Eventually, the liquid turned slushy, sometimes creamy, sometimes gritty. But to you, it was perfect. It was the taste of effort and laughter and shared anticipation. Your arms ached, your hands were cold, but your face was all smiles. You scooped it out with a big spoon and passed it around. And even if it was melting before you sat down, it still felt like the best dessert you had ever had. You could not buy happiness, but you could shake it together in a tin can. And for families that did not have extra for the store-bought kind, that homemade concoction meant more than anything with a brand name ever could. A sock with a hole was not trash, it was potential. You could turn it into a puppet with some buttons and yarn, or you could twist it into a rag and clean the table. Either way, it got one more life. Nothing got wasted. Your mom had a drawer full of old socks, some mismatched, some worn through the heel, all waiting for a second act. Saturday mornings meant chores, and those socks turned into your tools. You dusted shelves, wiped windows, polished anything with a flat surface. And if you were feeling creative, you stitched on some eyes and made a new friend instead. Puppet shows with your siblings were free entertainment. You gave them names, accents, full personalities. They were silly, lopsided, and full of heart. You did not need a store to give you something to play with. You just needed imagination and an old piece of clothing. That was childhood in a house where every penny mattered. You learned that being poor did not mean being bored. It meant being inventive, and a sock was never just a sock. When you were too small for the kitchen table but too old for a high chair, your parents got creative. They grabbed a stack of phone books, thick ones with worn-out covers and curled edges, and slapped them onto a dining chair. Boom. Booster seat, no buckles, no fancy padding, just the names and numbers of every person in your county, lifting you up to plate level. It was not glamorous, but it worked. You slid around a bit, and sometimes the stack leaned, but you felt big. Grown up. Part of the group. You could cut your food without looking up at it. You could see what everyone else saw. And that meant something. When dinner was done, the phone books went back under the sink or into a closet. They served their purpose until the next meal. You never questioned it. You never asked for better. Because when you grew up poor, better was not always an option. But solutions? You had plenty of those. And this one came with free directory assistance. You had a boombox and a blank cassette, or at least one that used to hold something else. You covered the little tab at the top with tape and recorded over it. That was the trick. Whether it was the radio or a borrowed album, you captured it, static and all. You waited for your favorite song to come on, fingers hovering over the buttons, heart racing. And when it did, you hit record, like your life depended on it. Sometimes the DJ talked over the intro. Sometimes you missed the first few seconds. But it was yours now. You made your own mixtapes before anyone called them that. You labeled them with whatever pen was closest and guarded them like treasure. Music was not something you streamed. It was something you chased, caught, and saved. Buying new tapes was out of the question. They cost real money. But taping over old ones? That was pure genius. You learned early that recycling was not about the environment. It was about survival. You made do. And sometimes those tapes were better than the originals because they had your voice, your taste, your memories, all caught in a spool of magnetic tape. You could hear the crinkle before you saw it. That brown paper bag, flattened, folded, and wrapped tightly around a school book. It was not just protection, it was tradition. Your mom would cut it just right, folding the edges like origami until the book fit snug. Then came the markers. You decorated it like it was your locker door. Doodles, your name, band logos, maybe the name of a crush in tiny letters. It was yours. Unique. Free. You did not have the shiny plastic covers the kids at the back of the class had. But you had a bag from the corner store, and it did the job. Sometimes you would find grease spots or faded brand logos from the groceries it once held. That just made it better. You were repurposing, recycling, reusing before any of those words were trendy. And when the cover wore out, you did it all over again, book by book, bag by bag, because money was tight, but creativity was not. And every book you carried had a story, even before you opened the first page. Some kids showed up to school with glossy covers and cartoon characters. You showed up with the back of a Cheerios box wrapped around your history textbook, and you were proud of it. That cardboard held strong, it bent, it folded, and it turned yesterday's breakfast into today's school supply. You would tape the edges, maybe add a sticker or two, and carry it like it was made of gold. And why not? It worked. It lasted longer than paper, and it made use of something no one else wanted. You saw it in other kids' backpacks too. Fruit Loops, Raisin Bran, cornflakes. It was a quiet sign that you were not alone, that other kids were also figuring it out. Your parents probably told you to be careful with the book, borrowed from the school, not yours to keep. That cereal box was your shield. It kept pages clean, spines intact, and your pride in one piece. Growing up poor meant finding value in every box, every wrapper, every leftover scrap. And sometimes it meant that breakfast helped carry your education, literally. If you opened the kitchen cabinet in a house where money was tight, you would probably find a tower of empty butter tubs and Cool Whip containers, not one or two, a full stack. You had to move them around just to get to a plate. And no, they never had what the lid promised. You learned early, if it said Cool Whip, it was probably beans. If it said butter, maybe soup, maybe pasta, maybe last week's dinner. Who knew? That was part of the adventure. These tubs were the budget Tupperware of the poor. They held leftovers, craft supplies, nuts and bolts in the garage. If something needed holding, it went into one of those containers. They were free, they were everywhere, and they lasted forever. Some of them even had dates from 5-10 years ago. You would pull one out and say, "This was from Thanksgiving, right?" And your mom would just shrug. "The container or the food?" she would say. You did not toss them out unless they cracked. And even then, you still kept the lid. Why? Because it might fit another one. There was a system to it, and heaven help the person who threw one out without asking. Reusing was not a trend. It was a way of life. Everything had value. And those containers reminded you every day that when you could not afford extras, you got smart with what you had. You could spot the struggle the minute you walked into the living room. 2 rabbit ear antennas poking out the top of the TV, wrapped in crinkled aluminum foil like some strange science experiment. You did not know if it actually worked, but you believed it did. That foil was the magic trick. It pulled in the fuzzy signal just enough so you could actually see what was on Channel 7. Sometimes it meant leaning the whole antenna against the window or twisting it toward the kitchen. And then you would stand still. Do not move. Do not even breathe. Because the moment you shifted, the picture went out again. Your dad would call from the hallway, "Just hold it there." And you would freeze like a statue while he wrote down the football scores. It was a ritual, a frustrating, hilarious, oddly cherished part of childhood. You did not have cable. You did not even have a remote. You had foil, static, and stubbornness. You would adjust the antenna again and again, chasing a clear picture like it was some sort of prize. But when it finally came in, when the screen stopped rolling and the audio lined up, you felt like a genius, like you had won. That little square box gave you everything from cartoons to news to cheesy commercials. And if it took a little foil to make that happen, so be it. It was worth it. You only had 3 or 4 channels anyway, so when the dial broke, it was not the end of the world. But it was the end of choices. The knob popped off one day, maybe from turning it too hard, maybe from years of wear. After that, it was Channel 4 or nothing. You tried to twist it with pliers, maybe a pair of scissors jammed into the hole. But those tricks did not always work. Eventually, the whole TV set just settled into one channel like it had made up its mind, and you settled with it. You knew every show on that one channel: morning cartoons, afternoon talk shows, late-night news. If something big happened on another station, too bad. You heard about it the next day at school. Sometimes the picture rolled, sometimes it buzzed, but you were just glad it was on at all. Replacing the TV? Not happening. That thing weighed more than a washing machine and cost almost as much. So you adapted. You memorized every commercial. You watched reruns so often they felt like family. And when you got bored, you just turned it off and went outside, because when you are used to doing without, you learn how to make do. One channel was not a prison. It was just another reminder that life was not always about options. It was about gratitude. You did not go to Disneyland. You did not pile into the car for a cross-country road trip. Your summer vacation took place right in your own front yard. and it was perfect. All it took was a hose, a sprinkler, and a little patch of grass. You put on your swim trunks, dragged the hose out, and set that sprinkler spinning like a carnival ride. The water shot out in every direction, freezing cold and sharp as needles, and you ran through it like you were being chased, laughing, screaming, soaking wet and loving it. It was the cheapest joy on earth. Your parents sat on the porch with their iced tea, proud of the $5 fun machine spraying joy all over the lawn. You would go until your fingers wrinkled, your lips turned blue, and your mom finally yelled for you to come inside. Towels wrapped around you like capes. The sun warmed your face, and in that moment, you felt like the richest kid in the world. Vacations did not mean suitcases and hotel rooms. They meant moments, laughter, sunshine, and a hose with good pressure. If you had that, you had everything. There was something about the taste. It was a little metallic, a little rubbery, and somehow better than anything from a store. Drinking from the hose was a rite of passage. You played hard, sweat running down your back, and when thirst hit, you ran straight to the faucet. No cups, no filters. Just turn it on, let it run for a second to get the heat out, and bend down like a camel. Water splashed all over your face. You missed half the time, but you did not care. That water was ice cold, raw, and real, and it hit different. It tasted like freedom, like long summer days and bare feet on hot pavement. You would take turns with your siblings, arguing about who got longer drinks. Someone always hogged the hose. Someone always aimed it too high and soaked your shirt. But that was part of the deal. You drank, you laughed, and you went back to the game. Bottled water? That was for rich folks. You had a garden hose and a solid jawline to catch the stream. And somehow, it was enough. You never questioned it. You never asked for more. Because growing up poor meant you learned how to find joy in what you already had, even if it came from a sun-baked rubber hose. Secondhand school supplies were the quiet beginning of every school year. You did not show up with shiny binders or a full set of markers. You brought a pencil case made from an old zippered pouch, a backpack with one strap stitched together, notebooks with 3 pages missing, crayons that were already dull. The rulers were warped. The erasers chewed at the corners. But it worked. Your parents sent you with what they could scrape together, leftovers from the older sibling, donations from the church, or whatever the teacher could spare. You watched other kids unpack brand new supplies with labels still attached. You kept yours tucked away. You learned not to complain. And over time, you learned to make do. You shared. You borrowed. You figured it out. And maybe your name was not written in glittery pen, but it was there. In the margins, in the effort, in every page you filled anyway. Secondhand supplies did not mean secondhand dreams. They meant starting from behind but still showing up. Still doing the work. Still proving you were more than what was in your desk. No dryer? No problem. Laundry day in the 1970s meant a backyard full of flapping towels, stiff socks, and frozen jeans. If it was summer, the sun did its job. If it was winter, you hoped the wind didn't carry your underpants into the neighbor's yard. Clotheslines crisscrossed the backyard like spider webs, and every clothespin felt like a little soldier keeping your dignity from blowing away. Hanging clothes was a 2-person job, one to hand over the damp laundry and one to pin it while standing ankle-deep in muddy grass. The air smelled like soap and cold metal. And if the wind picked up, you could forget about matching socks ever again. Sometimes the clothes froze before they dried, turning your jeans into denim sculptures. Still, there was pride in line-dried sheets. They crackled when you crawled into bed and made you feel like you'd slept outside, whether you wanted to or not. Dryer? That was luxury. A working spin cycle and some wind was the real-world combo dryer of the frugal family. And once those stiff towels came down and were folded into a reused bread bag, it was time to pack for school, which meant grabbing your makeshift book bag and praying it held together. Blank VHS tapes were not just empty plastic boxes. They were treasure chests, the kind you could label, relabel, and fill up with your own little corner of television history. You remember the sound, right? That whirring click as the VCR accepted your latest recording project, whether it was The Muppet Show, a Disney movie airing on Saturday night, or just some random commercials you ended up watching later like they were rare artifacts. Back then, taping something off television was serious business. You had to time it perfectly. Hit record at just the right moment, or risk catching the tail end of a news anchor saying, "And now," before your show started. Fast-forwarding past commercials felt like a power move. Rewinding? An art form. And if you had one of those little tape rewinder machines shaped like a car, you were basically living in luxury. You wrote on those little white stickers with a level of care that rivaled school projects. Do not tape over. Disney only. Toys R Us ad. Keep forever. And when someone in the house recorded over your stuff with a football game, that was war. But if you wanted to really test your patience and your brain power, there was only one screen-based challenge that ruled them all. Bath towels used as curtains weren't a style choice. They were survival. You needed privacy, warmth, and something to block out the sun? Grab a towel. Not a fresh one either, usually one with frayed edges and bleach stains. You'd clip it up with clothespins, thumbtacks, safety pins, or whatever was handy. Sometimes you'd even wrap rubber bands around coat hangers to rig a curtain rod. Sometimes they matched. Most times they didn't. Maybe a beach towel on one window, a faded hotel towel on the other, and an old sheet layered in for extra insulation. They fluttered in the breeze, they sagged in the middle, and they smelled faintly like mildew, but they did the job. In the summer, they blocked heat. In the winter, they trapped it. Real curtains were expensive. These were free. You'd tell visitors you were in the middle of redecorating. But when someone came over, you just pretended it was temporary, even though it had been like that for 3 years. And if the towels came down, it wasn't to wash them. It was to be repurposed as blankets. But if your windows were questionable, your dinner definitely followed suit, usually straight from a can. Furniture from thrift stores or curbside finds gave homes that mismatched charm only necessity could create. A sagging couch from someone else's garage sale. A wobbly coffee table rescued from the sidewalk. Chairs with mismatched legs or beds with slats that creaked under every turn. This was what made a living room feel lived in. There was no delivery truck, just a neighbor with a pickup, or a slow push down the block with a dolly borrowed from Uncle Joe. You sprayed it down, you wiped it twice, and you made it yours. Some pieces were covered in throws to hide the rips. Others leaned against the wall to stay upright. But they had character, stories, a past you never asked about. In kitchens, the table might have a burn mark or a dent from years of use, but it still held dinner. In bedrooms, dressers groaned when you pulled the drawers, but they closed eventually. New furniture was for people with money. For everyone else, you took what you could get, and you were thankful for it. Because when money was tight, having something, anything, to sit on was a win. You did not care how it looked. You cared that it worked. Hand-me-downs from cousins you didn't even like were a rite of passage, wrapped in a garbage bag and smelling faintly like someone else's attic. You never asked for them. You never wanted them. But every few months, your mom would show up with a stack of perfectly good clothes that had survived multiple siblings and were now headed straight for your closet. The shirts had pilling. The jeans had weird stains. The shoes were 2 sizes off but still got shoved onto your feet with the lie, "They'll stretch." Sometimes they were cool. Most times, not even close. Your new winter coat had 3 previous owners and a name written inside the collar that wasn't yours. You didn't get to complain. You were told to smile and say thank you when your aunt handed them over with pride. Kids at school might notice. You learned to deflect, to joke, or just to keep your head down. But deep inside, you dreamed of clothes with actual tags and no suspicious armpit wear. And just when you wanted to disappear into the couch had plans of its own. Made-for-television movies in the 1980s were not just filler. They were events. Whole nights were planned around them. When that promo would come on, this Sunday, only on ABC, you would perk up, lean in, and make mental notes to not miss it. This was before DVR, before pause buttons. You missed it? You missed it. These movies had titles like The Day After, V, The Final Battle, or The Ewok Adventure. Some were tearjerkers, some were thrillers, some were straight up terrifying, and they had you glued to the screen, wondering how they managed to squeeze so much drama into 2 hours. Plus, commercials. Families would make popcorn, dim the lights, and treat it like it was an actual premiere. You watched it live together, and you talked about it the next day at school, because chances were everyone saw it too. They hit different. The music, the narration, even that grainy picture, it all added to the mood. You were not just watching, you were part of something. And right in the middle of those movies came the strange intermissions, ones that could go from innocent to haunting in 5 seconds flat. Liver and onions wasn't a meal, it was a warning. The smell hit you before your mom even called you to the table. You'd walk into the kitchen and be greeted by the heavy scent of sizzling regret. The liver, tough as a tire and cooked until gray, sat under a pile of translucent onions meant to soften the flavor. It didn't. You were expected to eat every bite because it was good for you. Translation: cheap protein that kept the grocery bill down. Some parents even called it a treat, as if anyone ever asked for second helpings. No ketchup could mask it. No bread could bury it. You just chewed and tried not to breathe through your nose. It was bitter, mushy, and stuck with you, literally and emotionally. Some kids tried hiding it in napkins. Others fed it to the dog under the table, only to realize even the dog had standards. Leftovers went into sandwiches. Sometimes it reappeared the next night, reheated and even tougher. You'd chew for what felt like hours while staring at the clock, counting down the minutes until dessert, if there was any. Still, you ate it. Not because you liked it, but because that was dinner. The kind of dinner that made you appreciate peanut butter more than most people ever will. And if the meal was grim, at least the cooking fat had a story of its own. Limited or no air conditioning meant summer nights were a battle with the heat. The box fan sat in the window, humming like a tired engine, barely moving the thick air. You sweated through your sheets, drank warm water, slept with the lights off and the windows wide open, hoping for a breeze that never came. Some homes had one window unit, and it stayed in the living room. Everyone gathered there like refugees from the sun. No one moved. The couch was soaked in humidity. Tempers flared, ice trays emptied fast. You wore as little as possible, stuck your head in the fridge, and counted the hours until dark. At school, kids talked about central air. You could not imagine it. The idea of a whole house being cool felt like science fiction. You made popsicles out of juice in ice cube trays. You wrapped wet washcloths around your neck. You laid on the floor, hoping the tile was cooler than the bed. And through it all, you survived. Uncomfortable, sticky, and half asleep, but alive. No air conditioning was not ideal, but it made you tough, and it taught you how to endure heat, not just in your house, but in life. Absence of health insurance meant every cough came with worry. You did not go to the doctor unless it was serious. You did not get checkups. You got through. Headaches meant aspirin and a nap. Fevers meant cool rags and soup from a can. Broken bones? Maybe. If you could not walk on it, you might go. Otherwise, it was taped, iced, or ignored. Your parents did not talk about money unless they had to, but medical bills were always the unspoken fear. You knew someone who waited too long. You knew someone who got lucky. You knew it could go either way. Dentists were a rare visit. Glasses were repaired with tape. Every illness came with a dose of prayer. And if you did go to the emergency room, you braced for the bill before the diagnosis. But you learned to be tough. You learned to treat the small stuff at home. You learned to read symptoms like a second language. And even though it was risky and scary and never ideal, it made you aware of what you had, or what you needed, and how much a simple doctor visit could feel like luxury. Commercial jingles in the 1980s were not just background noise. They were the soundtrack of your childhood. Short, catchy, and borderline hypnotic. From "I do not want to grow up, I am a Toys R Us kid" to my buddy, wherever I go, he goes." These little songs became national earworms. You knew the tune before you even understood the product. And even now, decades later, you probably remember all the lyrics without trying. Fast food chains, toys, theme songs for cereal, they all knew how to brand themselves right into your brain. And we loved it. These were not just ads. They were pop culture. Kids would sing them on the playground like they were chart-topping hits. Some even had dance routines. And the best ones? They felt like a little burst of joy in between the shows you came to watch. It was marketing, sure, but it was also magic. A 30-second clip that made you beg your parents for action figures, Happy Meals, or the latest sugary snack with a weird mascot. And yes, even today, if you hear the opening note of "Gimme a break, gimme a break," you know exactly what is coming. But when it came to making your own mix of hits, that required serious patience and a strong dislike for chatty radio DJs. A coffee can full of bacon grease was the unofficial flavor station of every poor kid's kitchen. You'd see it sitting proudly next to the stove, no lid, no label, just a dented old can full of meat drippings and ambition. Every time bacon hit the skillet, Mom would pour off the fat and stash it for later. Why waste a perfectly good ingredient when it could fry tomorrow's eggs, crisp up potatoes, or even flavor the pancakes? That can held the essence of 100 breakfasts. It was thick at the bottom, layered with sediment like geological bacon history. Sometimes it congealed into a creamy mess. Sometimes it smoked like a chimney when reused for the third time that week. But it worked. It added taste, it added calories, and it saved buying oil. It was both seasoning and survival. And if the grease had a few bacon bits floating around, even better. You dipped bread in it. You reused it until it practically developed a personality. Bacon grease didn't just cook, it connected generations. But if bacon grease was gold, the cereal situation was less shiny. Using public transportation exclusively meant your life moved on someone else's schedule. There was no jumping in the car for milk, no last-minute rides. You waited. At bus stops, on corners, in the rain, in the cold, in your Sunday best or your work shoes. The bus was never early. Sometimes it was late. But you waited. You held a pocket full of exact change. Maybe a transfer stub. You knew the routes like the back of your hand. You sat near the front if you were tired. In the back if you did not want to talk. You watched strangers argue, laugh, cry. You saw your city from a different view, block by block, stop by stop. Owning a car seemed like another world. Gas, insurance, repairs. Those were luxuries. The bus was what you had. And it was enough. Sort of. It got you to school, to work, to church. You learned to carry groceries in bags that would not break. You made friends with the drivers. You memorized delays. And when the ride was over, you stepped off into whatever came next. Public transportation did not just move you. It taught you patience, resilience, and how to hold on when the brakes hit hard. Back before virtual reality, Viewmaster reels were the closest thing to teleportation we had. A small red plastic viewer, chunky and indestructible, that you held up to your face like some kind of sci-fi binoculars. But inside, whole worlds waited. You'd flick the lever with your thumb and instantly jump from a still frame of Mount Rushmore to a three-dimensional jungle scene with elephants that felt like they could walk right out of the frame. Some reels were cartoons, others were travel photos. Some were straight-up educational, which somehow made you like them even more. They were quiet, simple, and personal. You did not share your Viewmaster. That was yours. A private little universe. Every kid had their favorite reel. Maybe it was the one with dinosaurs. Maybe it was the space shuttle. Whatever it was your escape hatch from a math worksheet or a rainy Saturday. The 1980s weren't about flashy screens or downloads. They were about plastic, paper, light, and wonder. And somehow, that was enough. Actually, it was more than enough. But if you really wanted to feel like you were holding the future in your hands, you did not stop at a Viewmaster. You went for the gadget that talked back. Limited extracurricular activities were just another way the world reminded you what you could not afford. Other kids had piano lessons, karate classes, and sports teams with matching uniforms. You had afternoons at home watching TV or playing outside with a stick and a rock. Sign-up fees were too high, equipment cost too much. Even the rides to practice were out of reach if the car was needed for work. You brought home the flyers from school and left them on the table, hoping. Sometimes they just disappeared. Sometimes your parents gently explained that maybe next time meant probably never. You cheered from the sidelines, you watched from the crowd, and you learned how to clap with a smile even when your heart wanted in. It was not fair, it stung, but you found other ways to grow. You read library books, you drew comics in the margins of your notebook, you played tag until the sun went down, and maybe you missed out on trophies and tournaments, but you learned resilience, creativity, and how to find joy in the quiet spaces. You might not have worn the jersey, but you still showed up, and that mattered. No-name brand cereal in a baggie was breakfast for those of us living on the edge of the food pyramid. You didn't find it in the cereal aisle's middle section. You crouched down, way down to the bottom shelf and grabbed that crinkly plastic sack filled with sad, dusty flakes or weird puffed things that kinda looked like Fruit Loops but tasted like cardboard hope. No mascot. No prize inside. Just a white label that said Toasted O's or Sweetened Corn Crunch, like it was trying to convince itself it was worth eating. You poured it into your bowl. It made a sound like packing peanuts, and then you hit it with that pitcher of powdered milk and watched it all turn soggy in under 30 seconds. No snap, no crackle, barely a pop. But it was cheap, real cheap. Mom could buy a sack the size of a small dog for less than half the price of the name brand. And if you complained, you were told to sprinkle a little sugar on top and be grateful. That cereal may not have been fun, but it filled you up. And speaking of things that didn't fit quite right, your next outfit probably had a long family history. Minimal holiday decorations did not mean less spirit, just fewer lights. No inflatable snowmen, no blinking rooftop displays, maybe a single strand of lights across the front window, half of them flickering, maybe a tree with sparse branches and mismatched ornaments, paper stars, popcorn strings, hand-painted bulbs that chipped year after year. You reused wrapping paper, saved bows in a kitchen drawer. Stockings were sometimes just socks. The gifts were few but thoughtful. A scarf someone knitted, a book from a yard sale, a secondhand toy wrapped with care. The meals were simple. Maybe a turkey, maybe just a roast chicken with canned corn and mashed potatoes. But there was laughter, there was warmth, there was effort. Other houses looked like magazine covers. Yours looked like a family doing its best. And somehow that made it feel more real, more honest. The magic came not from extravagance, but from intention. You learned that holidays were not about perfection. They were about showing up with what you had and making it matter. And even now, when you see a tree decorated with plastic snowflakes and faded tinsel, something inside you smiles. Because that was enough. And in your memory, it still shines. Making a mixtape in the 1980s was not just about the music. It was about what the music meant. This was not a playlist you could throw together in 5 minutes. This was a curated collection of feelings, carefully selected for maximum emotional impact. Every track had a purpose. Every order was intentional. You did not just make mixtapes for yourself. You made them for friends, for crushes, for breakups, for birthdays, for sitting in your room, staring at the ceiling, thinking deep thoughts you had no business thinking at that age. You would spend hours hitting pause and record, rewinding to check the transition, trying to fit exactly the right number of songs on each side without cutting one off too soon. There was a science to it, a rhythm, a philosophy. And then came the cover art. Doodles, stickers, fake band logos, scribbled lyrics, little hearts and broken hearts. The label on a mixtape said everything about who you were or who you wanted to be. These tapes were gifts, time capsules, emotional resumes. You gave one to someone and it meant something. It meant a lot. But if you did not have the patience or just wanted to cheat the system a little, you could always get a dozen albums for the price of a gumball. Almost. Government cheese in a cardboard box was the kind of food you didn't ask questions about. You just knew it showed up, sliced thick, and lasted forever. It came in a plain brown box, no branding, no nutrition label, just cheese. Well, sort of. It was dense, bright orange, and had a melting point somewhere just short of lava. You couldn't cut it with a regular knife. You needed a cleaver or an axe. If you managed to get a clean slice without bending your kitchen utensils, you were basically a culinary lumberjack. It was too rubbery cold, too nuclear hot when melted, and somehow still the MVP of 1,000 meals. But once it got shredded or melted, eventually, it showed up in everything. Casseroles, grilled sandwiches, macaroni that was mostly elbow, and very little cheese. It coated broccoli like glue. It welded 2 slices of bread together like a bricklayer's dream. It was a badge of thrift and a staple of survival. Kids brought it in sandwiches that weighed more than their textbooks. Moms hoarded it like gold bars in the freezer. And no matter how processed it was, it held communities together, one heavy slice at a time. You either loved it or tolerated it. But everyone respected it. That cheese made stretch meals possible and gave every dish a glow like a construction vest. Still, no amount of cheese could disguise the smell of what hit the frying pan every Thursday. Limited or no access to personal telephones meant communication was never guaranteed. In some homes, there was only one phone for everyone, mounted to the kitchen wall with a long, tangled cord and a rotary dial that made even quick calls feel like a task. You waited your turn. You whispered your conversations with one hand covering the receiver. If the bill got too high, it was cut off. Simple as that. In other homes, there was no phone at all. You walked to the corner store and used the payphone with a pocket full of dimes. Sometimes you called collect. Sometimes you asked someone else to make the call for you. Emergencies became logistical puzzles. Job opportunities were missed because there was no way to call back. School events were forgotten because the message never made it through. Friends with their own phones lived in a different universe, where connection was constant and convenience was normal. But for you, every call had weight. Every ring had meaning. And when someone picked up, it mattered more than it should have, because the line might have been shared. But the stories, the check-ins, and the whispered "I'm okays" were always personal. MTV in the 1980s was not just a channel, it was a movement. The second you heard that iconic "I want my MTV," you knew you were about to step into another world. A world where music lived on your screen, not just your speakers. Where your favorite artist could become a visual legend. It played music videos, actual music videos, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That meant you could go from watching Cyndi Lauper dancing through city streets to seeing Michael Jackson turn into a werewolf without ever leaving your couch. Music became cinematic. Performances became stories. Seeing someone on TV who made you feel like you were not the only weirdo out there. And maybe, just maybe, being a weirdo was cool. MTV introduced you to bands you never heard of, genres you never explored, and visuals that burned into your brain like neon on wet pavement. You would tape videos, argue over countdowns, and swear that your favorite video was art. But when you got back to school, it was back to basics, and one look at your folder would say everything your mouth could not. 2 kids in one twin bed was not a punishment. It was standard practice. The mattress sagged in the middle, the blanket never covered both people at once, and the sheet always came untucked by midnight. You'd start out politely, one kid on each side. By morning, it was a tangle of elbows, knees, and dreams interrupted by someone snoring. If you were lucky, you were the bigger sibling and claimed the wall side. If you were the youngest, you got the foot warmer job, curled sideways across the bottom like a human space heater. The springs creaked like an old barn door. The pillow smelled like every head that ever used it, and the mattress was more duct tape than fabric. But it was a bed, and you didn't question it. You whispered secrets under the covers, argued over the blanket, and negotiated elbow room like diplomats. Nobody had a canopy bed or memory foam mattress. Just a squeaky twin, shared love, and nightly negotiations. And if you wanted privacy, you faked sleep. But the real test of patience and strategy came when you tried making a call on a phone that looked like it had been through war. The Pee-Chee folder was like a social billboard. Everyone had one. Those tan or yellow folders with athletes printed in faded ink on the front. Football players mid-tackle, baseball players mid-swing. They were meant to be neutral, practical, but they never stayed that way. Because the moment that folder landed on your desk, it became a war zone of doodles, lightning bolts, band logos, stencils, flames, hearts with names inside them, graffiti letters that took 15 tries to get right. Every inch of it became your personal art gallery or battlefield. These things aged like ancient relics by the time June came around. It did not matter how boring the class was. Your Pee-Chee folder made sure you had something to focus on, something to claim. And if a substitute teacher tried to take it away, that was a declaration of war. Of course, personal style extended beyond the page, because it was not just about what you carried. It was about what you wore. And in the 1980s, you had better know how to roll your jeans or risk social exile. If this brought back a memory, drop it in the comments, tap like, and subscribe for more just like it.